And the final talk of the CCP EM Spring Symposium is going to be Paula da Fonseca from the LMB with a case study of drug development, which hopefully will be spark some more discussions later. So with no further ado.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for holding it till the end of the meeting. What I'm going to tell you is about the work that I've been doing on the proteosomes and exploring EM as a tool for drug development. First of all, the proteasome. Most of the people that work in biological systems hear about it. It's a very large protease complex. It's essential for all eukaryotes because it has a key role on proteostasis. But most importantly, it is involved on the removal of proteins that signal for essential processes in the cell, like cell cycle progression. Because the proteasome inhibition induces apoptosis primarily of fast-dividing cells, it has been a target for cancer therapy for a very long time. Drugs that are used for, or proteasome inhibitors that are used in against multiple myeloma are already on their second generation. But further than as anti-cancer, proteasome inhibitors are also being explored, or proteasome inhibition is also being explored for really quite varied conditions, varying from inflammatory conditions, viral infections, tuberculosis. On the other hand, we have to bear in mind that the reduced function of the proteasome is actually neurodegenerative, and conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are really associated with the downregulation of the proteasome activity. So the proteasome is the last complex involved in the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, in which a cascade of ubiquitin conjugating enzymes attach ubiquitin signals to proteins that are going to be degraded. These ubiquitinated proteins are recognized by the proteasome, and this will proceed to unfold the target protein, translocate the unfolded protein into the proteolytic sites, cleave it, release protein fragments, and all of this is done while the ubiquitin itself is actually released for recycling. In terms of its composition, the proteasome comprises a core that contains the proteolytic sites. In eukaryotes, this core is a barrel formed of 4 rings, 2 alpha rings at the end, 2 beta rings at the middle. Each of these rings is formed by 7 subunits that are highly homologous, but they are all of them different. They are distinct subunits. And we know quite a lot about their organization because the first crystal structure of a eukaryotic proteasome was solved not much less than 20 years ago. And what is really interesting about it, it reveals the location of the proteolytic sites well within the inner chamber of the complex. So the proteins that are going to be degraded have to find their way through into this very tight structure in order to be degraded. There are variations of the proteasome in higher eukaryotes. These include the immunoproteasome, where the active subunits beta 1, beta 2, and beta 5 are replaced by their immune counterparts. There's another variation of the active beta 5 subunit in the thymoproteasome. And one interesting thing about the complex is, okay, the core itself, as I showed you, is a very, very tight structure. So, but it still keeps some activity towards small peptides and unfolded proteins. However, full activation requires its association of regulatory complexes. There are quite a few of them. Of those, the one that everybody talks about is the 19S regulatory particle. Is an ATP-dependent activator that confers specificity towards the ubiquitinated substrates. It associates with the 20S to form the 26S proteasome, and these 19S regulatory particles are actually quite interesting on their own. They are formed by at least 18 different subunits, which comprise a quite interesting variety of functions, including ubiquitin receptors. 6 of the subunits are ATP-dependent alpha-aldehydes that also work as translocases, and they are scaffolding subunits that actually recruit additional factors into the proteasome, including additional ubiquitin receptors and ubiquitinase enzymes. While I was still at ICR, I worked with Ed Morris on the structure of the human 26S proteasome. We managed to get a structure that at its best regions was about 7 angstroms. The resolution declined towards the ends of the complex to about 10. But this was really enough to model or to fit models for all of the canonical subunits of the proteasome. And with this, we created a model for that pretty much accommodated the whole complex. We did this for East complexes. Others did it for the East. Nevertheless, even if we have now a quite interesting, or we know now the overall organization of all of the proteasome subunits, the fact is we still have we still need higher resolution, and it's not just a matter of validating models or actually incorporating new features that or new structural data that meanwhile became available. But what we really want to do it eventually is really to do ab initio modeling of all the subunits, and with that, to directly infer into the detailed mechanisms of the proteasome, because the knowledge about those is really, really limited. Still, what I'm going to tell you about at the moment is the work that we've been doing on the 20S core itself. And you may ask me, since the proteasome was crystallized almost 20 years ago, the eukaryotic one, why do we bother to look at it on EM? The fact is, there are quite a lot of functional, or most of the functional mechanisms of the proteasome are still not really clear at all. One of them, just as an example, is the activation mechanisms by capping. What I mean by this is, we know that binding, just simple binding of regulatory particles to the 20S enhances the basal peptidase activity. And this really led to a model that was accepted for quite a long time. What happens is that the binding of these regulatory particles really open an axial gate of the 20S that would that would allow access to the active sites. In reality, in our structure of the 26S, and this is really the 20S core within the 26S context, we actually don't see any of such openings. And we don't see it's not in our structure, it's not on the East complexes. So something else must be happening to lead to that activation that we still don't understand. Further than that, actually, the paths into the proteolytic sites themselves are really not known. It is not clear if they are defined, if this is really just a random access to the proteolytic sites that leads to degradation, which would be unlikely because the proteolytic products are actually quite consistent. Information that we have about the active site only comprises the non-prime side of the active sites, so just upstream of the cleavage side. There are mechanisms that are products of the proteasome that are really not very well explored, which is the peptide splicing. What is the meaning of it? How does it occur? We don't really know. And as I mentioned, the proteasome is a major target for drug development, and we really need to understand fully its function in order to properly target it. Further than that, what we want to know is, can we actually get by EM resolutions that are enough for us to load substrates or small molecules that we can visualize and use to understand the complex? In order to do that, I actually got hold of human proteasome samples. This is the 20S only. And I decided to add it to inhibitor to it. I actually chose this molecule very naively because it was the largest inhibitor that I found. And basically, if it's to see something in our structure, I would assume, okay, the bigger the better. It actually has higher potency than the shorter vinyl sulfone inhibitors, and it binds equivalently to the threonine residues, the proteolytic active threonine residues of beta 1, 2, and 5. I want to make a note here, because there are quite a lot of work being done on 20S proteasomes by EM. I have to say that most of them, all of them, apart probably as far as I'm aware, what I'm going to show you here is done in archaeal complexes. And there's a big difference in between looking at archaeal and eukaryotic complexes. And this is because in archaea, each of the proteasomal rings is formed by identical subunits. So basically, the core itself is formed by 14 identical alphas and 14 identical beta subunits. This confers to the complex a D7 symmetry. It's a very behaved sample on standard EM grids, and for that reason is actually a very suitable test sample just to check the performance of the microscope or to test reconstruction algorithms. On the other hand, the eukaryotes, as I mentioned to you, each of the rings is formed by distinct subunits, which confers to the complex pseudo sevenfold symmetry. And the only true symmetry axis that complex has is a twofold in the middle of right in the center of the complex. Other thing that makes this sample a little bit more unfriendly is the fact that it doesn't really behave as well as all that on EM grids. And I show you that here. This is actually negative Stein, and this is how the sample looks like on carbon in grids that are going to discharge in air. Basically, all you have here of the really vast majority are really top views of the complex, viewed along its long axis. This very much is useless for a 3D reconstruction. On the other hand, if I just treat the carbon or do the Claude discharging in the presence of pentylamine, this is what we get. And this is exactly the same sample, exactly the same tube, the same batch of carbon, just treated differently. And what we get here is predominantly side views, and these ones, because they're really rolled 180 degrees, they have all the information that we need for accurate 3D reconstruction. So just a few technical things. I will go through this quickly. So we actually use quantifoil grids with a thin layer of carbon that were, for the reasons that I showed you, they have been glow discharged in the presence of pentylamine. Everything was flash frozen in a Vitrobot. Collected data on a Titan Cryos with a Falcon 2 camera. Data collection took 8 hours, I admit, because EPU failed. We had a pixel size of about 1 angstrom. And this is all the data was collected by EPU. I mean, this is very much what Dan showed you this morning. What we do is to create to record an atlas of the whole grid. We select the squares that we're interested to image. Within those squares, we select the holes that we want to record. And the EPU software really just does the recording of all the images that we previously selected. From these, we recorded a total of 780 images. We used 545. And the selection was just based really on the inspection of the quality of the data by looking at recovery of the CTF in the power spectra. This is how the images look like. In cryo, the contrast is inverted. Now for the processing, so we did exposures of 1 second to a total of about 50 electrons per square angstroms. The total sum of our frames was used for the peaking, taking advantage of the higher contrast. And by doing so, we selected 7,500 particles by using automatic peaking in relying and followed by manual exclusion of false positives and addition of false negatives. For processing itself, for the refinement, we simply summed frames 3 to 10. We excluded the first 2 because those are known to be the ones affected by beam-induced effects. So all the images actually have quite a lot of motion. Stopped at 10 because that would correspond to accumulated dose of about 25 angstroms. And further from that, we have risks of having radiation damage. The refinement was done using old Spider alignment software. And I used the ICR3D program that was developed by Ed Morris at the Institute of Cancer Research for the 3D reconstructions and also the version for the projections in order to create references for the next round of refinement. By doing this, this is how the sections of the map look like. These are 1 angstrom thick. There's no sharpening or filtering or anything imposed on these images. This is exactly as it comes out from the 3D software. And I find very interesting as if you really look carefully, you can immediately see, so these are 1 angstrom thick, and you can immediately see the twist for alpha helices. And if you look, you can really see individual beta strands on beta sheets. So we have a map. Creating a model of the whole complex is not really so complicated because we have very good templates from X-ray crystallography. We recover most of the side chains, both in helices and beta sheets, or beta strands, sorry. In terms of resolution, the map is actually quite consistent, except for the exposed loops. And one interesting thing that we have is we have very good recovery of side chains, but where they are really constrained either by spatial constraints or because of protein-protein contacts. So where the side chains are exposed to solvent, both at the outer surface or the inner surface of the proteasome, those ones are really not well recovered. And this is really just the fact that this happens both at the outer surface of the complex and the inner cavities indicates that this is due to solvent exposure rather than artifacts due to the contact of the protein with the carbon. So I told you that I had this proteasome with this inhibitor. Can we see it? Indeed, if we actually look at the active sites, in this case, we're looking at the beta 5 subunit, we can see that there's a density clearly extended from the proteolytic active threonine 1. Just looking a little bit of more in detail, this is actually just a rotation from what I just showed you. You can clearly see we can really orient both the vinyl sulfone group and the 3 leucines of the complex, of the inhibitor. So we can really recover all the peptidic moieties of our inhibitor. We don't really find the densities for the rest of the inhibitor, and yet with hindsight actually is not surprising, because this is used to introduce modifications that, fluorescent tags and bioteins that are used to mark as markers of the proteasome in cells. And we know that these modifications don't affect whatsoever the kinetic properties of these inhibitors. So this is a clear indication that actually it will not really form much interactions with the protein or the proteolytic active sites, and most likely it's just really unstable or flexible within the inner cavities of the proteasome. Looking at the other 2 active sites, we have densities as well for the inhibitor. In those cases, the densities are weaker, and this is consistent with variations on the ligand occupancy. And it is when, And one thing that is quite interesting is actually to compare our results with what was obtained by Grohl's group in Munich. So using X-ray crystallography, they used a ligand that is quite similar to what we had. The peptidic and vinyl sulfone groups are common, but they only found the ligand bound at the beta-5 active site. Both of the complexes in the yeast and the human complex take similar conformations. And the fact is that actually, in terms of kinetics, we would expect equivalent occupancies in the 2 complexes, which is not happening. And we speculate if this is really not just a simple consequence of the methods of preparation of our samples. While for EM, we incubated our sample exactly like for kinetic studies. The concentrations are exactly the same. The molecule or the protein was incubated for 1 hour, 37 degrees, previous to flash freezing. And we have occupancy that really preserves the expected specificity. On the other hand, we all know that when we want to look at ligands in crystals, in protein crystals, we either have to do co-crystallization with excess of ligand, or we soak the existing crystals with the high concentrations of the ligands of interest. In all cases, what really has to be preserved is the integrity of the crystals. And we know quite well that most often those are not really, don't represent physiological conditions, and very difficultly they would really represent true conditions for proper protein-ligand interactions. So what we have is that, or what this indicates is really interesting advantages of using EM and really exploring EM for protein-ligand interactions, having the advantages of allowing closer to physiological conditions to be used. And although we still not as high throughput as X-ray crystallography, the new developments or current developments still on the instrumentation and software will actually get us there. And we also have the ability of looking at samples that may not be so suitable for X-ray crystallography, although the samples have to have their own standards for EM analysis anyway. So this is very much as a proof of principle, okay? We can really look at, use EM to look at ligands on the proteasome. And this led to a very interesting collaboration with Matt Boggio in Stanford. So Matt has been interested for a long time on targeting the Plasmodium falciparum proteasome as an anti-malarial. So Plasmodium falciparum is a parasite responsible for the most severe form of malaria. Artemisinin is the frontline treatment currently against malaria, but the fact and TUIU received the Nobel Prize of Medicine for its discovery. So this is actually derived from plants used in traditional Chinese medicine. But the point is that they are increasing in the spreading of resistance against artemisinin. And that really poses a massive threat to human health. And really it is urging the development of new antimalarials. So the data that Matt had is that he really showed that inhibition of the proteasome, of the parasite proteasome, is toxic for all its stages. And, but however, the efficacy of inhibiting the proteasome, of the Plasmodium proteasome, as a treatment was questioned because we have proteasomes as well and they are conserved. So can they really be targeted very specifically? Other thing is that in order for drug development, normally we really need very high resolution data. And the Plasmodium 20S score evaded crystallization. And this is, the reason is as simple as, it's not so trivial to produce enough quantities and with enough quality from the cultured parasites. So when I met Matt a couple of years ago, we actually just gave talks one after the other at the Protein Society. The data that he had, in order to move on with the identification of the differences in between human and parasite complexes that could be explored on drug development, came from the profiling of the cleavage of the amino acid cleavage preferences for both the Plasmodium and the human complexes. And what he found, it was that the Plasmodium complex has a very unique preference for large side chains at positions P1 and P2. And these ones are counted upstream the cleavage side of the substrate. From this, Matt synthesized a prototype inhibitor. This is a vinylsulfone inhibitor like the one I used before, in which he has tryptophans precisely at positions P1 and P3. And what he knew from the characterizations both in vitro and in culture, it was that this inhibitor really has a very specific preference for the BT2 active site of the Plasmodium proteasome. And the fact is, now we really need structural information in order to understand the basis for that specificity. So Matt sent me some samples and some of the inhibitor. The strategy for the data collection and image processing was exactly the same as I've done for the human complex. This is the map that we got, again, sections of about 1 angstroms. That again show the modulation for alpha helices and beta strands. The map overall was a little bit more stable than the human, but it really showed exactly the same properties of being more unstable and the side chains not being so well recovered in surface exposed regions. Just some details of the map, so separation of beta strands, side chains well recovered both in alpha helices and in strands. And we found densities for the inhibitor, as shown here. Once again, we managed to get densities that are good enough to orient the different side chains of the peptide. And as expected from MAT studies, we found it exclusively at beta-2 active site. In this case, we have the full molecule moduled. And if we look at our map, it was quite rewarding because we can really understand the basis for this specificity. And in reality, it's very simple. Is that the beta-2 active site of the plasmodium complex really is much more open than any other of the remaining beta-1 and beta-5 sites from the plasmodium and any of the human sites. And particularly, is the only one that can accommodate, I actually show you here in a little bit more detail. This is actually just the ligand, or the representation of the ligand in the active sites of the beta-2 active site of both of the plasmodium and human complexes. And we can see that while in the plasmodium, both at the position P1 and P3, the threonine side chains can be reasonably well accommodated, there are really steric constraints for the access of those residues in human active sites. Saying this, I have to make clear that this specificity is observed at the concentrations of the ligand that we used. Higher concentration and the specificity is lost, and eventually the inhibitor can bind to all of the active sites. So this was actually exciting. We have an inhibitor of the proteasome that targets specifically the plasmodium complex, and we have basis to understand why. The fact is, inhibition of the beta-2 subunit itself on its own is not sufficient to eliminate the parasite. But on the other hand, it actually can synergize with the artemisinin in resistant parasites that have their stress responses impaired, and in that case is very efficient for its elimination, which actually raises a possible therapeutic usage of derivatives of this particular compound. On the other hand, if we look back at our structure, we can see that while the tryptophan position P1 can only be accommodated on the beta-2 active side of the plasmodium complex, actually the P3 position, or tryptophan, can be accommodated in both the beta-2 and beta-5 positions. And indeed, Matt produced and also had another inhibitor on his hand, another prototype, in which the P1 position was replaced by a leucine compared with the ligand that we used previously. And what Matt observed, both in vitro and in culture, it was that this is extremely efficient to remove the parasite. Most of all, the data from other collaborators really show that this is really a potent anti-malaria, or it has a potent anti-malaria activity in mice models of malaria, showing very little or no observed toxicity to the host. So this actually is extremely promising. And what I find really quite rewarding is that we have information that led already to suggest variations on our ligands in order to improve the specificity of our inhibitors. But I really appreciate is at this stage, our structure is actually being used to further develop these ligands in molecular dynamics, using molecular dynamics approaches, and is already producing very interesting results. By saying this, what we show is that while the proteasomes are conserved among all the eukaryotes, fine differences exist in between species that can be explored for a specific targeting. And what I'll show you here faces really the Plasmodium falciparum proteasomes and its inhibition. in development of antimalarials. In reality, most likely this will be applicable also for the proteosomes of other disease-causing protozoans, including Trypanosoma, Leishmania, Toxoplasma. And just because of the complexity of proteasome preparations from these parasites, most likely that cryo-EM is going to be the method of choice to obtain the information needed for the development of specific inhibitors. Saying this, I want to say thank you. I mean, all of this work on the 20S, I've done it while I was establishing my group at LMB. I have to say a big thank you to Ed Morris, with whom I have a long-standing collaboration on the structure of the human proteasome, and who allowed me to play with his software. Matthew Boggio, for really putting together a very, very useful collaboration, and a really pleasant collaboration, to validate Plasmodium as a viable target to antimalarials. And his student, Haldy, so she was the one that gave me, prepared the samples and did all the characterizations in vitro and in culture of the different inhibitors that we used. I have to thank Ifyai Fellows, Christosava and Sasha for helping me with the use of the cryos, Jake and Toby for keeping our clusters working, and for all the nagging that I have to do every now and then when things are not really processing as well as I would like. And thank you all for listening.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Great final talk. Gerard?
So I don't want to rain on the EM resolution revolution ticker tape parade, but I've heard twice now today that EM sample conditions are closer to physiological than crystal structures. 35 years ago, the NMR community was making the same argument. They say we're now going to study the structure of proteins in solution, which is completely free of the constraints of crystals, and we're going to see what proteins really look like. And to their surprise, it turns out that actually in solution, structures still look exactly the same as in the crystal, to the extent that crystal structures tend to explain NMR data better than the NMR structures that they are derived from. So I think you have to be careful with claims like that until there is more than n equals 1 or n equals 2 or 3 indications to support that. And the other thing, I would urge this community, please do not make the same mistakes that crystallography has suffered from, making these mistakes for 30 years. So when you build structures at 3 Angstrom resolution or worse, you have to use prior knowledge. So I saw the slide where you were rubbishing X-ray. You had this ligand density where the 3 leucines in a row on your ligand, and the middle one of that had a completely unphysical side chain conformation. If you'd used Rotamers, you would have found that the most common Rotamer, 67% of all leucines have that conformation, would have fit your density even better than the thing that you had built there. So please, do what crystallographers have painstakingly learned over the years. Look at your outliers, look in the density and see if there's a more sensible and more common way of building your model in terms of Rotamers and Ramachandran plot and classes, etc. Then.
What I have to say, I absolutely agree with you. I don't think that necessarily you're going to get different structures, or in terms of protein, that our structures are going to be better in terms of defining the protein structure as anything as you achieve by crystallography. No worries at all about that. And I don't think that EM is necessarily going to exclude crystallography, by no means. Right? But one thing that I stand for is that we can really preserve this selectivity of our ligands. And that would be very difficult to preserve on crystallography, simply because we have to expose the protein to saturated concentrations, right? Which we don't do. And this was actually, for people working on the proteasome field, it was something that really struck them, is the fact that finally we can really see occupancy that is consistent with what they see on their kinetic studies. And that is not usual, at least for the proteasome, right?
So, any more questions?
Do you anticipate that resistance will become an issue with the proteasome target for Plasmodium falciparum?
Because the Plasmodium proteasome is really fundamental for the parasite, I would find it unlikely, right? Because also the Plasmodium proteasome the Plasmodium is a simpler system than the higher eukaryotes. For instance, in human cancers, melanoma can become resistant to existing proteasome inhibitors that are used against cancer, right? But in that particular case, probably we have compensation of different active sites, and we have actually alternative variations on the proteasome that probably kick in. What the mechanisms of resistance are actually not very well established. In the Plasmodium, because the system is simpler, I would not anticipate it to be, but I cannot really speculate further than that.
Thanks. Any more questions? In that case, can we thank Paola again?
Thank you.